one of the aspects you have to remember when you're looking at the United States, and this is in some ways similar to Canada, but this is why Canada and the United States are also different, is the United States is a migratory location. With the exception of Native Americans, everyone else is a fairly recent immigrant, in most cases very recent, say in the last 200 years. And so there isn't any long-term embedded history of place. This is one of the things that makes Americans, and then we're going to use U.S. Americans in this context, very different than here in Hawaii. With Hawaiians, you have somewhere between 600 and 1,000 years minimum of embedded place, in the sense that people have been in the same place or around the same place for literally hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's also true of Europe. You look at someplace like, say, southern Italy, and a village there might have been around for 1,500, 2,000 years, where we do our research in central China in Shanxi province, and say like the town of Sunyi, which is north of Xi'an, has been there for roughly 4,000 years. Now, that doesn't mean that the families have been there for 4,000 years, but that place has been there for 4,000 years. People moved in and out. And I can guarantee you the land names, in terms of the names of mountains and stuff, have been around for a really, really, really long time. So for most people on most of the planet, they have a very intimate relationship with their physical landscape and even the built environment, because it's embedded in their social, collective, and individual histories and their family histories. That's not true in the United States. The United States, Americans are migrants. As I mentioned before, this is probably one reason why Americans feel so comfortable changing residences so frequently. If you don't have a strong sense of place, then moving to another place really doesn't have a lot of emotional, social connotations to it. It doesn't have a lot of impact because you're not really tied to that place. This, of course, is a huge point of tension here in Hawaii in terms of place and sort of ownership and control of place, etc. So when you're looking at this, you have to remember the United States is a very different location, and by what you might call sort of the Anglo-European, cultural tradition, society is a very, very different one, because it is largely migratory and really isn't attached to place here in the U.S. Now, the other part that makes it radically different is the version of Protestantism, which is absolutely central to the American lifestyle. Protestantism is a big part of sort of Western European tradition. It's, of course, part of the Reformation movements against the Catholic control of the Catholic Church, et cetera, et cetera. But as Weber and a bunch of other folks pointed out when they started looking in the 30s and 20s and 30s about why areas of Northwestern Western Europe were different in terms of success, attitudes, and values than the rest of Europe, above and beyond, say, just cultural patterns. They came up with this idea of what they called the Protestant work ethic, or the Protestant ethic, which was a huge part of sort of studies and literature and discussions in the social sciences all through the 20th century. Sadly enough, was also a huge part of the sort of ethnocentrism and genocide that you see, say, in World War II. So it, like a lot of these other social, sort of research movements, is they have a lot of social sort of connotations or implications above and beyond, academia. A subset of that is what you see in the United States. And these are what I just label Calvinist. The Puritans, Calvinists, same thing. It's just two different terms for the same religious movement. But the key here is that Calvinist Puritanist, or the Calvinist Puritanist religious movement, which is almost sort of a cult or, very specialized movement, really doesn't pick up force in most of Western Europe and remains a minority thing, except in areas of Switzerland where it's still key. But what happens is the large numbers move here into basically New England part of North America in the colonial period, and become a huge dominant influence in what becomes the United States. And most importantly, in terms of behavior, attitudes, and values, it becomes an absolutely unique, very specialized part of the American social system. And this is one of the areas where the United States is radically different than Canada. Canada didn't have the Calvinist Puritans, at least not in any form, that had impact. And in the colonial period, they didn't have any traction. So, what you had north of the American border into Canada was more classically, British Anglican Puritanism or Protestantism. It really wasn't the Calvinists, which were sort of the U.S. version. So we're going to take a look at this because this absolutely is absolutely critical when you're trying to understand American built environments and American logic of how we see ourselves, how we see the world around us, and how we build and shape the world around us, all the way from a coffee table to cars to houses and all the rest of the world that we have. This, of course, becomes hugely important because in the late 20th and 21st century, American values have oftentimes, they've tried to export them in some cases successfully and some not. But since the United States is one of the world's global superpowers, it's sort of scary to realize that the American social value system is the way that we view the rest of the world. So we view other cultures and other places in terms of how close they fit our view of the world, how the world should be. And that's grounded in this Calvinist Puritanism. Now, just as a note, I'll get into this later, but remember that the Calvinist Puritans are always a minority here. So they're never in the mainstream religious movement. That's always different versions of the Protestant movements and, Catholicism, etc. But that doesn't mean they aren't central. And we'll get into that as we do this discussion. So some of this is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to sort of skim over it. The PowerPoints have it. The history part is a good example. That's pretty much what happens. Calvinism starts up in, I believe, Northern Austria, Southern Germany. John Calvin is the original founder. Violently anti-Catholic. Violently the idea that the church or a religious institution could tell people how to worship. So one of the key premises of Calvinism right down to today is it's entirely driven on the idea of the value of the individual, the importance of the individual. Calvin's basic message was that you go to heaven or hell based on your own individual merits and efforts, not the group. So you couldn't have sort of absolution. You couldn't go and have confession and have a priest basically, absolve you of your sins. The only person that could deal with your sins was you because you're the one that generated the sins. So Calvinism at its very crux is entirely individually based. And it's important to remember that while Calvinism initially starts in Europe and moves through Europe, it never becomes a key force in Europe, with the exception of parts of Switzerland. And so this is one of the reasons why if you look at the Brits or, other areas of Europe, like say the Dutch and other areas where there were Calvinists, you don't find this absolute fascination with the idea of the power of the individual. That becomes peculiarly American. And it's one of the areas where Americans are different than Canadians, is this idea of the importance of individualism over the value of the group. So Calvinism, moves through Europe, becomes a big force in the English Civil War, and then moves to New England, specifically, largely the Massachusetts Bay Colony. If you ever read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, that's actually a description of the Calvinist in New England, who by then are oftentimes calling themselves the Puritans. And the reason they use the word Puritan is the idea that they're the only pure Christian religion. So it's a very not subtle way that they viewed themselves. The Calvinist Puritans, in all their forms, were incredibly intolerant of any other form of Christianity. They really didn't see a lot of difference between being Methodist, Protestant, Catholic, or Muslim or Buddhist. You're all the wrong thing. So the Calvinist was really a fundamentalist version of Christianity, which saw the world in a very light switch way. You're either Calvinist or you're not. And if you're not, you're in a world of sin. And so this becomes one of the key things. One of the reasons they're intolerant is one of the reasons why they get thrown out of many places. They just couldn't live with neighbors. They're incredibly intolerant. Eventually, their intolerance in Massachusetts is why the British government actually sends in military forces to take the colony away from the Puritans, Calvinists, because they're actually executing people. The Salem witch trials are the Calvinist Puritans. So their view of the world was a very intolerant, very brutal, very two-dimensional, very black and white world. And you see this, for example, in their clothing, which was limited to black and white. So they were not part of the normal English pattern, much less part of the normal European pattern. They were very much what you would almost call a fringe cult in the modern context. Certainly a very fringe religious version of Christianity. One of the key aspects of this, and let me segue into part of what's important, and we'll make sense of this in a second. In Calvinism, one of the basic premises from the get-go is that the Bible is actually the Word of God. So if you're reading the Bible, it's actually God speaking to you. Now, for some reason, I've never quite understood why the Calvinists had no problem with the idea of people translating the Bible, which seems sort of odd to me, but whatever. So reading the King James Version of the Bible is actually you communicating with God. There's no intermediary between there. The text is literally God speaking to you. So it was a very, very fundamentalist view in the same way they say fundamentalist Islam in the 21st century, where the Quran is basically the word of Allah being spoken. This was the Calvinist. Now, in that context, if you need to communicate with God, you can only do that through the Bible. Prayer wasn't seen as really a form of communication. You communicated through the Bible. So, for example, if you had an issue, you would have your Bible. These are big, thumpy things. You literally drop the Bible, and whatever page it opened up to, and whatever piece your eyes fell on, was God talking back to you. So you interacted with the text in the Bible, and that was your interaction with God. You didn't need intermediaries. There was no point in having a priest or a preacher or anything like that, because what good could they do you? They couldn't tell you what part of the Bible to read. That was you. So this sort of hyper individualism is key to Calvinism, which makes it different than almost the other forms of Protestants, like say Anglicans or Methodists or something like that, which are very group oriented, not the Calvinists. They're entirely individual oriented. So in this context, if you've got to interact with the Bible to reach salvation and then talk to God, then you got to be able to read. So right from the get-go, one of the really key parts of Calvinism was literacy. If you couldn't read and write, well, more specifically, couldn't read, then you couldn't talk to God. It didn't do any good for anyone else to read the Bible to you. You had to read it because you had to interact yourself with God. And so they became absolutely focused on the importance of education. So for them, education was not an option. Education was part of religion. Education was a necessity because you had to give everyone the option of going to heaven. You had to give everyone the option of talking to God. If they chose not to, then fine, they were the devil's children, and to hell with them, and that's where they're going to go. They're going to go to hell. But you had to give them the option. And so it's the Calvinist Puritans that are the ones that set up public education in the United States. Now, they've done this to a certain extent in England, and it's one of the reasons why there was a little bit of tolerance for them for a while, but basically they were just such a pain in the ass to live next to that people just chucked them out. But when they set up in Massachusetts, they're the ones that basically make public education compulsory. Now, they're not interested in you reading or Instagram text or a paper or a book or something like that. They're only interested in you interacting with God through the Bible, but literacy is literacy. So to them, being literate was not an option. Being literate was an obligation. And if you were going to be a good Calvinist Puritan, you had to teach everyone around you to be literate, because that was part of your obligation to God, to bring other people to God. So it was their version of knocking on doors, or like Jehovah's Witnesses, trying to preach you or convert you. Calvinist conversion was literacy. And so Massachusetts becomes the first colony in North America, in fact, the first colony in the British system, that required public education. And it was free because, of course, to the Calvinists, that was their version of going to church or Sunday school. So the Calvinists basically funded public education as part of their religious movement. So then there was no distinction between the school, the little red one-room schoolhouse, and the church. They were the same building. And it's not by accident that schoolhouses would have little steeples on the top with a bell. They looked like little churches because they were churches of education, churches of learning, because this was how you built your relationship with God. So as ironically as the Calvinist Puritans lose political power, what they do is they move more and more away. They sort of go guerrillas. So what they do is they move away from being in political control of New England to basically the idea of being religious control of New England through the fundamentalizing of public education. So what you find is in the American colonies, prior to the Revolution, the Northern New England colonies had compulsory public education. You don't see compulsory public education in England until the 1840s, 1850s. In fact, in some areas, 1860s, 1870s. So you see compulsory public education in the New England colonies a good 100 years before you find it in England. One of the side effects is you find a huge proportion of the American population is illiterate by the time of the Revolution, when maybe 15% of the English population at the same time was literate. Most of the British Army, for example, wasn't literate that fought in the American Revolution. But most of the Americans that fought on the side of, the colonies in the American Revolution were literate. It was one of the huge distinctions made by Americans and how they were different than the Brits, was this literacy. So what had happened along the line is Calvinism had quit becoming a explicit religious movement that was obviously religious to sort of a subtle form of religion where what you do is you taught values, attitudes, and the power of the Bible and the power of God through teaching people literacy. So the exercises and the ways that you taught, the drills and the stuff that you taught people how to read and write, were all based in Calvinist values and attitudes. And because people liked the idea of free public education, everyone jumped on board, even if they may be a little uncomfortable about Calvinism. It's sort of like, hey, I don't really believe these guys religiously, but they're offering free teaching for my kids, so let's go for it. So the fact that it was free, as in many cases, free had all sorts of strings attached to it. So this is Calvinism. Now, what this means is that as the Calvinist religious movement becomes less of interest to majority Americans, by that time, Calvinism has become the de rigueur logic of the people who are teaching, especially in public education. And so by the time of the independence and, the American setup in the American state, you find that the United States is largely driven by public education. Most of the people who are teachers are trained in Calvinist theological seminaries or Calvinist religious schools, because they're the ones that teach people how to be teachers. Princeton, Harvard, Yale, all these places are originally Calvinist, and that's why they're in New England. And so what you get is there's no distinction made between compulsory public education and Calvinist education, which is a religious-based education, because it's the same thing. Other religious movements don't step in. Catholics had schools, Protestants and Lutherans and Methodists all had schools, but those were very small schools. They were generally private schools. You paid for them. Public education from the time of the colonial period tied to the public, i.e. government, is a Calvinist-driven thing. So to a certain extent, even at the time of the colonial system, the United States is driven by Calvinist religious values. Even though the vast majority of Americans weren't Calvinist, and I suspect even by the time of the Revolution, a lot of Americans really weren't too sure what the Calvinist religious theology was, but they had grown up and gone through the educational system, which was based in Calvinist virtues and values. So Calvinism becomes the social value structure or model that Americans get educated in, and it still is today. And so even private education, for example, in North America, well, I should say in the United States, very quickly becomes based on the Calvinist model, because if you're a private school and you want your graduates to be successful, they're going to be judged in terms of what they've learned vis-a-vis the public norm, i.e. the public education system. Now, one of the subtle side effects of this is even by the time of the Revolution, Americans don't see themselves as having a religious education. They're not going to religious schools. They're not going to a Catholic school or a Lutheran school. They're going to a public school. They're unaware of the fact that everything from the way that those schools operate to the lessons that they teach and everything are based in these Calvinist values. And so what you get is by the 1800s, Americans are actually living in a very religiously based state. But unlike any place else I can think of, they're not aware that their value system is basically religiously grounded in a minority form of Christianity, which is why it ends up looking so different than Canadians or other areas of British colonial period or England itself. The United States is a very unique place. As new groups come in as migrants, they're largely forced to go through the public education system, and so they too become assimilated in these values. They don't necessarily stick to the same extent, but nonetheless, they're exposed to them. And because you're Anglo-Americans, which is the majority population right into the 20th century, are brought up in this, then what you find is that this becomes the definer of the American value system. So you can see this if you look at schools, the idea of recesses, the classes start and finish, the idea that you guys have to have a certain number of credit hours to graduate, that somehow credit the amount of hours you spend in education as a form of the amount of education you've consumed or absorbed. Time management, all classes is based in time management. That's a very Calvinist thing. It's not by accident that the only other place where Calvinism is really big, which is Switzerland, is famous for timepieces and clocks. And if you think of the world around you, you look around your apartment or your house or whatever, you're going to find a lot of different timepieces from your phone to your watch to your coffee maker. All these things have time in them. And this is very, very much part of the American fascination with time, self-discipline, time management, and working are all sort of an embedded sort of package of all this stuff. So the key part of this is Calvinist, and again, this, you just have to sort of accept this for what it is. I don't know enough about the theology. Go bother someone else in the religion department about why. But the Calvinists, right from the get-go, are firmly convinced that time spent reading the Bible was God's time. So that was basically prayer. They also, for some reason, had a very strong sense that the time spent at work, actually, and by this I meant physical labor. So time spent where you were sweating, time spent where you were working hard and breathing hard, was actually a form of prayer. This makes it radically different. The other forms of Christianity, to the best of my knowledge, don't have anything like this. This is a purely Calvinist thing. And so the time spent working was prayer. And so therefore you wanted to keep track of your time because you wanted to keep track of the fact that you were spending a lot of time working, so that, you know, those little puns here, because that was God's time. So the Calvinist idea of a good day would be to wake up in the morning, read a piece of the Bible, go out and work, come back, have a quick lunch, read a little bit more of the Bible, go back and work till the sunset, come home, have dinner, read a little bit more of the Bible, and go to bed. And you just, repeat day after day after day. That was the idea of a time well spent. And if you did the world that way, you would go to heaven. If you got up in the morning, checked your text, watched a couple of YouTube videos, had some coffee, then hung out and did some stuff at work, and then came back and spent 2 hours at lunch and goofed around and hung around with friends, etc. That's the devil's time. So time that you're not spending working was the devil's time. And in the Calvinist view, in a rather cheerful fashion, they also saw when people were born that were actually the devil's children. So in the Calvinist view of people, humanity were actually the devil's children who have to work really, really hard if they want to go to heaven, because their natural inclination is to screw around and have a good time and not work, which means they'll go to hell. So work became morally superior. Leisure in any form became morally inferior. And so time spent working, or time visually being seen working, was morally good. Time not working was by definition then morally bad. So in this context, you had to at least look like you were working all the time, or else people would start to talk about you as being a morally destitute person. Don't follow him, kids, because he's going to go to hell, type thing. Now, what happens, of course, is by the 1700s is more and more part of even Calvinist population. If you're a teacher, for example, you're not physically working. You're working in a classroom, but you're not hopefully building up sweat most of the time. You're just working and doing stuff. So more and more Calvinism reinterprets the idea of work into time spent at work rather than physically hard labor. And so by the 1700s, what you get is time spent working, in regards to what type of work. But as long as it's defined as work, then that's the same. That's still God's work. Time spent not working is the devil's. And so if you think about it, this is still your view of the educational system from the time you were in preschool till your time here at Chaminade, is you spend time working at stuff. You get credit hours to graduate. You get 3 credits per class, like this class. You go to work in a regular office, and you're working there from 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 or whatever it is. And you have to show up on time, and you have to be there during your hours. And all of that is the idea of time spent at work as God's time. So what happened was initially a Calvinist thing, because they're running the educational system. This becomes the time spent in education, whether it be the recess, whether it be the time spent in math, then going to a time spent in English or whatever. All of this becomes a construct of this idea of the value of time, and that you should always spend your time working. This is why Americans have a really hard time Americans have a very hard time taking vacation. And especially now with the power of social media, it's very difficult for Americans, even when they leave work, to leave their phone and not check their work emails and not do work when they're not at work. It's actually one of the things I find that's interesting in online classes. If it's a weekend and I'm not doing something, people get agitated because I'm not checking my work during the weekend. I'm thinking, well, why should I? I hate to say it, but I'm not Calvinist. So that context that, you're supposed to spend time working is very much a part of that. But notice how the key flip is also equally powerful, which is time people that don't work. So people that are homeless, people that don't have a job, people only working part-time, are therefore morally destitute. Now, notice how this also means, to a certain extent, if you're hardworking, notice how you use that term, so typically American, means that automatically means you're good. People that are slacking off and not working are by definition also equally bad. And there's all sorts of connotations, not the least of which, should hardworking people help slackers out. Should people that work hard and pay their taxes, for example, support those that don't work hard and don't pay taxes? And if they do, why should they? Because in the Calvinist logic, you're just helping someone that's going to go to hell. We'd be better off to just abandon them and force them to work, and therefore that gives them a better chance to go to heaven. So notice how what you get is these social values still have this religious connotation to them, though people I don't think of them being Calvinist. They just think of it like it's now moral logic. Very much part of the whole discussion in the 21st century on modern politics in the United States. Another part of all this then is time is measurable. This is why the fascination with timepieces. You have to know how many hours you spend at work, and you also know how much time you spend at leisure. And that becomes measurable. If you spend more time messing around than you do working, then you're by definition a bad person. So time is measurable. You get paid by the hour, especially if you're doing piecework. So the idea that you can measure time, that it's actually something that has substance that can be measured out, just like a thing of cloth or string, that it's not mutable, that the time doesn't vary, that it's part of this unilinear system where it's always the same. That's very, very much a part of the Calvinist. Now, you have to remember, this isn't true of the majority of the world's population. For most of the world's population, including traditional Polynesians, time was mutable. Time wasn't always the same. An hour now might the same measure as an hour 10 years in the past or 10 years in the future. For many societies, both in Polynesia, but certainly in Asia, time is circular. So, since Chinese New Year's is coming up, Chinese New Year's is part of a circular system of 12 different symbols that rotate through a very complex pattern of 4 and 6 different wheels of time. And so in a period of time, the same thing comes around after, I think it's 126 years or something. So in many societies, time is circular. In the Calvinist view, it isn't. It's unilinear. It's just like a train track. It starts in one spot and goes down a track to another spot. So you can't go back in the past. You can't go back and redo the past to make it better and to, for example, work harder to make up for your mistakes when you're messing around, etc. And of course, not the least of this, which is so central in American society, is time has value then. And so therefore the concept of an hourly wage, that you pay people an hourly wage. So you're measuring their value by virtue of the time that they spend at something. If you combine this with this idea of individualism I mentioned before, you realize that very quickly you get into this really sort of interesting logic that in Calvinists, since we're born of the devil and you have to use the Bible and work hard to become worthy of salvation, go to heaven, then everyone has to do that on their own. The only function of a church, which is why they're called Congregationalist churches, and they are here, since I should note that the Calvinists, of course, are the ones that come here in 1821. So, the fact that we have what are oftentimes Unitarian or Congregationalist churches here is a standard of the Calvinists. So the function of a church to Calvinists would be people would gather there on Sunday so they could display their, religiosity. And what you would get is people would do testimonials and talk about how, had gone through some sort of life crisis and they'd read this section of the Bible and the Bible guided them to, more salvation. They're not going to preach to the rest of the group about read this part of the Bible and what it'll do for you. That's not Calvinism. That's very typical what you see on TV with Southern Baptists and other groups, but not Calvinists, because Calvinists are entirely based on self-discovery. So everyone is then based in self-discovery, which of course, if you want to go to heaven, is self-improvement. So Calvinism is very, very big on every individual pulls himself up from their bootstraps. Every single individual has to find their way in the world and become successful and become better. And you have to work on this constantly, because if you slack off or relax a little bit, you're going to slide like going down an escalator and go back into the hands of the devil. And then you're going to have to run really hard to get back up ahead again. So every individual is responsible for their own salvation. The group has nothing to do with it. The group can encourage you to read. The group can actually teach you to read. But it's up to every individual on their own to achieve that. And so in this context, then, of course, new is always going to be better than old, because old means stagnant. Old is what you were. Old means that you're not working at it. So change is always new and change is always better, as long as it's this idea of improvement. So, one of the classic American slogans is change is necessary for growth. Not something that's held true in Europe or almost any place else I know, but it's very much an American thing. The idea of new and improved, an American absolute fascination is central to everything, like the new iPhone or the new Samsung phone. new and improved is absolutely key to Americans, because you not only have to improve yourself, this also means you have to improve the world around you to show that you understand the logic of all this. So what happens a lot is gets involved in display. You not only have to improve yourself, you have to show others that you've done so. Okay, let's stop right here and I'll get into the next one because it's going to go on for otherwise.